culture, bring it back and forth, and experience with a person, and also living in the United States. So, and how that different paradigm is always being reasoned, and how I think the basic denial of indigenous thinking processes is always taking a second seat. And so we're here to maybe change that or bring notation to the system that has basically put us in communities where radio stations across the United States, we did a survey about 5 years ago where there was only 43 native-owned radio stations, but of those 43 native-owned radio stations, they weren't really native-owned. 37 of them were owned by Christian organizations. Therefore, they had a lot of influence in what people would contact you would hear. And the only time that you wouldn't hear anything native would probably be late at night or early in the morning, which is true of a lot of community stations. You hear places maybe 2 a.m. in the morning or very early in the morning where you don't really hear native people. And if you do hear something, it's more of an NPR-ish take, a very soft sell. Okay, we can accept native people who are dancing and playing flute and saying all the nice things rather than being political and really sticking to how we are defending the land and being real with that. So that's just a little bit about what I'd like to talk about today, and I know Kehalani has a lot to talk about as being one of the sole producers and hosts of the public radio program in Wesleyan University. It's called Indigenous Politics from Native to New England and Beyond. And for the last 6 years, she's been doing this and produced in those studios and is syndicated now on 11 stations across the country and it's through Pacifica Radio Network. And she's going to discuss some things as a producer and a programmer. And I'd like to emphasize that it's very different being, that through the years that I've only had a few people willing to stick with this different subject of native peoples or indigenous peoples perspective, because after a while it became too heavy and too hard for them, so they would back off. And so I've had several people host or I would say interns that would only be able to handle it so much because they have to deal with the reality of papal bulls of 1492, which I'm sure John will get to. And it's a lot of history. And Kehalani will talk about the ethical relationship from Hawaii, where she's from, to Turtle Island and her experiences and travels in Palestine. So it's really going to be, I think, if we pay attention to this, then the politics of the 21st century, government's attempts to remove indigenous peoples from our lands and from corporate resource extraction ranging from oil and minerals and water in relation to contemporary devastation, basically it's called all caused by genocidal implications. And so she will speak to this, mobilizing the economic, political transformation and broad-based resistance to this. So, Kehalani, thank you very much.
I'll just go to the podium more so I can pick up the audio plugged in over here. Good afternoon, everyone. Aloha. Thank you for attending. I know there's a lot of sessions on the books. Appreciate you being here. I want to start by acknowledging this is Lenape territory and acknowledge the sovereignty of the Lenape people. This is an ethnically cleansed territory, Manhattan, and those tribes have been reconstituted as far as Wisconsin, Canada, Oklahoma. They thrive, Lenape people thrive, and there are also Lenape individuals living amongst us here today. I also want to thank Tiopasin for organizing the session. I want to also, besides acknowledging Tiopasin and organizing the session, echo what he said around responsibility and rights. And in Hawaiian, the concept that we use is called kuleana. And that means you have an actual kuleana. It's often used to refer to a land area that you use and that you're a custodian to. It also also we use it in the vernacular to say, like, if someone's butting into your business, you can say, that's not your kuleana. But it also means it's not your responsibility or your right or your business. And so part of that is knowing our own purview and our own obligations and sense of relationality. As Tioka-san introduced me, I'm the sole producer and host of Indigenous Politics for Native, New England, and Beyond. I've been on air since February 2007. I'm an associate professor at Wesleyan University, and I got the call from the public affairs director of the station in the fall of 2006 asking if I would like to do a Native show. And I said yes immediately, not knowing exactly what I was going to get myself into, but I always wanted to be a music DJ in grad school, so I thought this will be one way in. And I've been on the air almost continuously. I took a brief hiatus last year, but I've basically been running since February 2007. All my shows are archived online at indigenouspolitics.com if you want to check it out. Although there's a .com, it's com, but it's totally free. And I also do the show as a volunteer. I don't get paid any money. I've never received a cent for doing the show. It's a Wesleyan-owned station, but it is part of the Pacifica Radio Network.
Don't get it, he said.
And only a third of the budget, operating budget, comes from the university. The rest is mostly raised from community listeners, and then there's some that get brokered through other stations that we partner with, where some NPR programs are aired. But that's basically less than a third of our programming on the radio station itself. I want to just also be really clear, I'm not a journalist, I'm also not a pundit. I took on the show, the subtitle from Native, New England, and Beyond was to ground myself and to understand whose land I'm on. I'm a Native Hawaiian woman, Kanaka Maoli. I'm living on Waingunp territory. Everywhere we are in Turtle Island and throughout the Americas, this is Native land. And when I first moved to that region in 2000 to take up my teaching position, there was already a really strong current of anti-Indian policy emanating from the state of Connecticut, from the Democrats who were intervening at the federal level in terms of federal recognition for tribes in the New England region seeking federal recognition. And so by the time I went on here many years later, I thought my primary kuleana would be to actually acknowledge the struggles in the region where I was residing, where I do reside, but the and beyond allows for a global scope, so it's very flux. And because I'm not a journalist and I am an advocate, and it's also, this is my primary area of research and what I teach Native sovereignty politics, I teach on U.S. colonialism in the Pacific. I teach on issues related to race and indigeneity and a class called colonialism and its consequences. I also want to just mention I have an anarchist show that I do with a group called Horizontal Power Hour, and I'm also going to be teaching a new course on anarchism, and I'm interested in the ways that anarchism and anarchist thought interacts with indigenous thought and principles. But so in terms of saying I'm not a journalist or a pundit, but not being a journalist, I'm very forthright about being an advocate. It's a pro-sovereignty show. There's no hidden questions for people. I've talked to tribal leaders and activists who tell me what's sensitive, what they might not be able to discuss because of legal issues, for example, or what their own priorities are and what they want me to emphasize, and they're responsive when it comes to that. I'm also not a pundit. I'm not talking a lot. I'm asking a lot of questions. I tend to do a lot of research beforehand. And part of the kuleana that I see is to actually especially target non-Indigenous listeners to unpack really what can be understood by many as complicated legal issues into lay terms so that people understand their own social and political and legal location vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples, whether they're federally recognized or not, and to understand not just the legal issues and battles and fights and resistances, but also to understand what it means for many people to actually engage indigeneity as a category of analysis and Indigenous peoples as nations when they are by and large living on land that they actually don't belong to in terms of that Indigenous claim. I want to talk more about the summary that Tioka read, but before I launch into that, I want to acknowledge two people who are in the room who have been guests on my show. I've met one before in person, Kent Lebsock, and I see Deborah Whiteplume sitting in the audience who I've not met in person. I just saw your name tag, and I recognize your photo from the media. I do a lot of phone interviews because I'm doing it in the booth at the station in Middletown, Connecticut, and I'm really, really happy you're here. So one of the things that I try and get at, that I want to make the link to in terms of the conference theme, mobilizing for economic/ecological transformation, is what Patrick Wolf calls the logic of elimination that's inherent to settler colonialism. People on the left tend to be very familiar with the concept of colonialism. Whether they take it up in their analyses is another issue altogether. But when they talk about colonialism, by and large, they are talking about franchise colonialism without marking it as such. And franchise colonialism is the example that I use is England in India, which is very different than England in Turtle Island, right? Settler colonialism is about replacing indigenous peoples. It's about settling land. It's about occupying land. And as Patrick Wolf theorizes, the centerpiece is land expropriation. And to actually expropriate that land, it's about the logic of the elimination of the native. That doesn't always have to include genocide, but we know from this context throughout the Americas that it has, and it continues to. Keystone XL pipeline that I've interviewed Deborah White-Plum about, and Kent Lebsock, who's talked about the Lakota Treaty Project. I see their work is literally stemming ongoing genocidal practices in the 21st century. In terms of the ongoing logics, elimination can happen through other measures of people who have survived frontier violence, frontier homicide. So blood quantum policies, that's all part of the logic and practice and policy of elimination. The erasure, the way that discursively people here say that they're a native New Yorker, that's still part of the logic of elimination. Native New Yorker, really? Are you Lenape? You know, are you one of the Carcery tribes or one of the other Muncie band, right? So when people say Native New Yorker or I'm a native Californian, so really what tribe? Oh no, I'm born and raised there. That's all about, that's nativism, right? That's not indigeneity, it's not native. It's nativism. It's all about replacing indigenous, and it's about indigenizing oneself as a settler. And it's also about insinuating oneself on the land. It's like a bad grafting job. There's no genealogy, right? So with the logics of settler colonialism, this is really, for us to even begin to talk about economic or ecological transformation, we have to acknowledge economic and ecological devastation. Well, we live in a settler colonial society. We are right now embedded in a settler colonial society. And genealogically, politically speaking, historically speaking, legally speaking, it stems back to settler colonialism, right? So you have Occupy Wall Street doing really radical politics, talking about the 99%. You had indigenous peoples immediately question the concept of the term occupy in that movement. And a lot of people, I think, misheard it as some nitpicking political correctness, superficiality, or nomenclature, rather than understanding that it's a radical critique of what it means to try and reclaim something that actually, as you said, who owns the bakery, right? As Teodosin said, it's not about breadcrumbs, it's about who owns the bakery and who's fighting for the breadcrumbs, right? And one of my colleagues and friends, Joanne Barker, has a blog called Tequila Sovereign, where she wrote several pieces immediately after Occupy Wall Street hit. She's based on Chicano Ohlone territory in what's known as Oakland, and really tried to push for Oakland to rename itself, decolonize Oakland, and wrote several blogs about this process and also what it meant for people. And I don't mean just whites, but non-indigenous peoples who felt put upon, that they were being challenged in terms of the name. You know, asking, well, what do they really want? What do I have to do now? And she herself is Lenape, and she actually talks about the roots of Wall Street. Wall Street, as some of you know, there actually used to be a wall on that street, and that was built by the Dutch to keep out not just the English settlers, but the Lenape people from their own lands. The first treaty that George Washington brokered was with the Lenape people, promising freedom of mobility in their homeland. We know that that didn't happen. They're forcibly removed by the federal government subsequently to many different spots, many different geographical sites. And so her point was, how can you talk about 21st century corporate malfeasance without understanding the roots of colonial capitalism and the Dutch East India Corporation, right? And we know that it's not just about indigenous peoples from Turtle Island, but you also have the making of the corporation through slave labor. You know, down by Wall Street, those are African burials down there. Right, so that's where it comes together, right? That's Cheryl Harris talking about the whiteness of property, and that the origins of property in this country are rooted in racial domination between stolen land of indigenous peoples and stolen labor of African bodies.
And so to me, there's no real discussion that's going to ever get to the root of the issue of economic and ecological devastation, let alone transformation, without getting to the root, which is not just colonialism, but settler colonialism. And so I want to just put that on the table. I also want to acknowledge that Tiokasin was a guest on my show. I've been a guest on his show talking about Hawaiian sovereignty and land rights and nationalism. But Tiokasin and Joanne Parker and several other Indigenous activists and scholars were on the show to actually talk about Occupy Wall Street. I interviewed 5 different people to actually try and get at the layers of what the critique entailed and how it was misheard or misunderstood or understood in very superficial terms in terms of, like I said, nomenclature or label. In terms of mobilizing for economic and ecological transformation, we know that these are really high stakes, and we also know that this has more to do than the devastation of indigeneity. Just like we know that corporate malfeasance did affect the 99%, right? But again, without getting to a root analysis, there's going to be something lacking because it also means that people are abdicating their kuleana or their responsibility to actually deal with the question of Indigenous peoples and whose land we're on. And it does stem from the land, as settler colonialism is always about land expropriation. That is its centerpiece. So you have 21st century governments attempting to remove Indigenous peoples from their land for corporate resource extraction ranging from oil to minerals to water. And in relation to this contemporary devastation, this has genocidal implications for Indigenous peoples throughout the world. I'm just going to use a couple examples from the Americas, or Abya North and South America. And part of this I want to acknowledge, of course, the genocidal implications. This is a human catastrophe, and it goes beyond Indigenous peoples. But I want to cite these Indigenous struggles because these are people literally on the front lines trying to stave off what governments are backing corporations to come after them. Right? We talk about it as a private-public split. But we have to remember, it's the state backing corporate interests, right? And so that's what's happening all over the place. These are all just very recent cases that made the news just in the last couple weeks. Canada is now moving to help Peru streamline its environmental assessment for mining projects, i.e. we'll show you how we subordinate our natives, so you can put down the native rebellions there that are trying to stop oil extraction. You have Indigenous Nicaraguans fighting to the death for their last forest, their ancestral territory in the Bosawas Biosphere Reserve, now targeted for logging. You've got the Huaorani in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, trying to protect their ancestral lands in the area now known as Usoni National Park and Biosphere Reserve. It's world-renowned for carbon-rich forests and extraordinary biological diversity, and is home to many endangered epidemics, and yet it's threatened by encroaching oil development, settlers, and illegal loggers. You've got the Brazilian president set to turn the Amazon into an industrial heartland to fuel the state's economy while over 240 tribes protest. Also in Brazil, you've got representatives of the local indigenous communities and environmental activists demonstrating in Sao Paulo against the construction of the Belo Monte Dam at Zinju River in the Brazilian state of Pará. In Alaska, news just hit last week that this might be the ground zero for the next big environmental fight, as one journalist put it, and that's Alaska's Bristol Bay mine project. This is a dispute over a proposed copper and gold mine near Alaska's Bristol Bay. It's a remote area that is home to several Alaska Native tribes and nearly half of the world's sockeye salmon. 6 tribes have asked the Environmental Protection Agency to invoke its powers under the Clean Water Act to block the mine on grounds that it would harm the region's waterways, fish, and wildlife. And I just want to pause there for a minute. That's a sovereignty paradox right there, that a tribe has to rely on a federal agency to try and evoke another federal act to try and stave off, right? It's the same government that's devastated the tribes that it has to appeal to, right? That's a structural problem. That's a paradox of Indigenous sovereignty as it's been subordinated and continues to be subordinated by the federal government. And just 2 more examples. You've got the nation's biggest uranium mines planned now to start again in New Mexico. 2 foreign-owned mining companies plan to sink a pair of shafts into the land near Mount Taylor. If approved by the U.S. Forest Service and state agencies, the mine would extract as much as 28 million pounds of the radioactive heavy metal and desecrate as many as 70 acres of land sacred to the tribes there that's been designated by the federal government as traditional cultural property already, right? And that's where federal plenary power always trumps in the name of national security. And we know that they'll talk about anything having to do with the economy and resource extraction as a security issue, right? You can construe anything as a national security issue. We know that because that affects non-Indigenous people in the 99%, right? So again, getting to the root of the issue. There's also unabated military expansion going on right now in Hawaii and Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. Especially with the Guam and Northern Mariana Islands, with the U.S. and Japan brokering a deal to remove the military from Okinawa, and they're looking to expand in Guam and dredging, and that is affecting the removal of the Chamorro people, also known as Chamorros, who are migrating to places like Oklahoma or Texas to try and find affordable ways of living. And the same thing happens in Hawaii with the Stryker Brigade that's there and ongoing military testing in Makua Valley now throughout the archipelago. And it's also the hotspot for all nuclear subs. It's also head of Pacific Command, as many of you know. I could obviously go on and on. We've got people here at the front lines fighting Keystone XL pipeline, but I'm not going to get into that because that's, if people on the left know about one kind of issue, they know about Keystone XL, but again, the Indigenous piece in that is usually what drops out, whose traditional territories that pipeline would go through. We also know that there's more than one pipeline. And again, what does that mean for the water aquifers? What will it mean for people who are on what has been left of their land for them to actually subsist on and not actually have fresh drinking water? That is genocidal, right? That's not being hyperbolic. That is genocidal. People cannot be on their land and they're forced to actually remove for their own survival. And so this gets to these issues of free, prior, and informed consent that John's going to talk about. As many of you know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which people are trying to mobilize and use as customary law because it's not a convention, it's a declaration. But if you put it into practice, it can become understood and used as customary law. Has the provision that says tribes have, not tribes, Indigenous peoples, which is used interchangeably with nations, tribal nations, Indigenous tribes. That tribes have the right, or nations and Indigenous people that outsiders must gain prior informed free consent. And what you have right now, and we see with the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples coming down the line next year, which Kent knows an awful lot about this, has been part of this for years. You have the states co-opting what's left of what made it into the declaration after the decades of drafting process to try and actually remove that phrase of free, prior, and informed consent to consultation, and to try and contain and co-opt and again domesticate all those issues so that the states can just deal with it, right? And again, that's the whole point, is that the Indigenous peoples are fighting their respective states that encompass them, which was the whole push to go global and to try and actually set the bar for some kind of bottom line standard in terms of the right to self-determination. So I just want to get at two more things and then I'll pass the baton. I mentioned Occupy Wall Street and the term of Occupy, and where I think the movement fell short in some cases. That's not to say that I want to acknowledge those that did change their name, but again, it's not just the name change. The name is loaded and has epistemological, political weight, but the critique is often still left out, right? And so what happened in those, in the aftermath for those, do they take on that critique in terms of their actual practices of trying to call into question corporate malfeasance and the devastation in terms of the housing crisis, and we could go on and on about that. But related to that is something that just proliferates and proliferates and proliferates on the left is radicals, progressives, liberals, in that whole spectrum, talking about reclaiming the commons, but again without actually acknowledging that when you're living in a settler colonial society, that the commons needs to be complicated because there's nothing common about stolen land, for example. So you have Naomi Klein's really riveting essay from the early 90s where she cites Indigenous people and land as one of the many struggles, but actually folds it into a larger discourse of reclaiming the commons, which we know on the left is common sense, right? This is seen as a metaphor for connectivity and something that all of humanity owns these different things, and that we've got to stop it from neoliberal market forces and try and save what's left of the commons from privatization. And yet, in those examples I just delineated throughout Yapiala, right, where there's this land there's this extraction of resources and land expropriation, and I said extortion, I think it's a Freudian slip, but I actually think you have, right? You're dealing with a lot of corruption in terms of those states. But that to reclaim the commons Again, the commons is something that the British brought with them. It is a property concept that they imported, say, in North America, for example, to actually talk about when they did corporate townships all throughout New England. The commons, for them, those are stolen native lands that they created for their own townships. So, I mean, I think we really need to complicate this notion of reclaiming the commons. I know that people don't intend it necessarily for it to be about the theft of native lands. You have the work, Donahue talking about suburban, gardeners, and you have people trying to, evoke the diggers and thinking about the radical sort of leveling in terms of economic inequality. You talk about, food sovereignty and such. But again, without getting to the root issue of settler colonial society and the logic of the elimination of the native, as that's Patrick Wolf's turn of phrase, it's always going to fall short. And so I guess the question there then becomes this issue of what might our struggles look like if everyday people were involved in these kinds of projects that got to the root of the issue. If the dispossession of Indigenous peoples that enables something like the nightmare that is Wall Street in all its manifestations today, what would that actually look like? And that gets me to my last main point, which is about the ethics of radical relationality, and to think about our ethical kuleana, our ethical responsibility to engage with Indigenous people whose land we're on, whether they're actually present as a collective governing entity or not. So for example, the Wangunk territory where I reside, the traditional name, as I understand it, is Manabesset, and it's also known as Middletown. Right? It took me a very long time to find out that I was on Wangunk land. When I first moved there from Santa Cruz, I moved in the summer, and they were going to have their 350th year anniversary parade for the founding of the city of Middletown, and I called city council and asked if the native people of the land would be partaking in this commemoration and who they are and what their name is. Well, they not only didn't know the answer to my question, they didn't understand the question. And I had to repeat it several times, and then I was seen as, like a shit stirrer, basically. Like, what are you on about? What do you want? And I said, well, are the native people? And she said, yes, there are people here who have been here for generations. And she named the number of generations. And she's talking about white settler descendants who trace their genealogy to the earliest colonials, right? So I said, no. And I tried to explain, because I wanted her to then understand the question. I knew I wasn't going to get the answer. And she literally was like, ma'am, I have to get my supervisor. She put her supervisor. Ma'am, is there a problem here? Well, yes, there's a really big problem here. Let me tell you what the problem is, right? There's this erasure. So then I was told, it took me a long time, and then I called the Connecticut Historical Society. They told me to call Foxwoods Casino. They didn't even tell me to call the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, right? Because the Foxwoods is owned by them. It was called Foxwoods. Yes, I'm going to call the casino. So, you get this kind of stuff, but again, the erasure. And then I learned about it from a scholar named Paul Grant Costa, who's been researching Indigenous peoples in that region and doing that work. And then come years later, I hear about a lecture in the basement of a church on the Wangunk and the first church on Main Street in Middletown. And in the audience is a Wangunk descendant who basically had introduced himself to the white gentleman giving the lecture to members of the church as a community event. I don't belong to this church, I just heard about it and went to listen. And the speaker ceded more than half his time to the Wangunk descendant. Turns out he's from one of the surviving families that literally survived King Philip's War in the 1600s, and they're invisible in terms of African ancestry and survivance that way. And he knows all the surviving people in the region. They're in the whole southern New England region because they all know what few survivors there were and who their descendants are. And this man is raised by his great-grandmother, who was raised with her greats, and so who have this unbroken chain through that line. And yet this is someone who's told, on the daily that the people aren't there anymore and don't exist, right? It turns out he's a Wesleyan alum. And, it is right there. He literally works like 3 streets away from where I reside. So you just, it's part of understanding that. But even if you can't find that descendant and go on that, part of the issue is, unless you live, many of us, many of you, unless you grew up or live or reside in a state like Washington where tribes are visible, or Arizona or New Mexico, you're not necessarily going to know whose land you're on. And if you're in removal states, and most of the states in the US are removal states that have been ethnically cleansed, and where there's forced removal of tribes, right? It wasn't just the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, it's over 35 tribes being removed to just that place, and then other indigenous peoples removed to other places, right? But to try and get at what happened there, we can't understand this nightmare that we're living in with US empire without understanding that that's the base, that's the core, that's the root. And part of that quest of understanding what happens, say, if you are a New Yorker, what does it mean to then start to embark on learning about the history of the Lenape? What would it have meant? What could it have looked like for people at Occupy Wall Street to even just engage in a dialogue by actually making contact with the actual Lenape tribal nations that are organized as governments, to even broach a conversation? What could that even look like? I'm not necessarily saying that the Lenape people were waiting for it or would be, in with Occupy Wall Street, but the whole idea of what does it mean in terms of that acknowledgement? And that acknowledgement, I mean that in the root term, right? To actually gain the knowledge, to actually recognize, to be cognizant of something. And that is part of it, is learning about those layers of settler colonialism and the genocidal logic of elimination, to get again at the root and to understand that history, I think, is what is absolutely fundamental, or the precondition to actually talking about ecological and economic transformation. I think in order for us to mobilize, we have to actually know what all has happened, because again, those cases that I cited, it's indigenous peoples on the front line who are living on those territories. Right? I've interviewed people in the Dakotas who are literally living on the land where all the power lines are that are giving electricity to all the surrounding states, and they're living in motorhome trailers without electricity. What does it mean that they're living in the heart of where all the electricity is being exported to everyone else? Right? So this is all contemporary, right? And that's the other thing about settler colonialism. Even if people just talk about colonialism, the franchise kind, it's again relegated to the past in terms of how people talk about it. And I think we just have to absolutely reject that. That is again part of aberration. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you so much, Mahalo.
Oh, our next guest, John Kane. You say, are you? Carrillo. And it's Mohawk from Ganawake, who's doing a radio program in Buffalo, New York on WWKB on the AM radio station. And John has to pay for his time on the air. So, this is very unique, that how much he's devoted and, dedicated and, committed to bringing out the news in that area in Buffalo, especially the Seneca and the Colorado Reservation and that area, operating on that frequency. And he has a website that is explosive, I would say, all the time. It's really making me think every time I read it. It's called Let's Talk Native Pride.blogspot.com, so you might want to check him out. And he's here now, and he wants to talk to us, and I invited him down because he has a direct connection with the indigenous people here in the Six Nations in this area in New York. So this is John Kane, a good friend of mine. Thanks.
Sego. I'm Winnegahaga, and that means I'm of the people from the land of Clinton. We're known as Mohawks. I live in the territory of the Umudawaka, which is the Haudenosaunee people who live in the area of the mountains of western New York. The Senecas. My wife is Unyota, and you may know that those people as Oneida. I am very, very tied to the people of the Haudenosaunee, not only because I am Haudenosaunee, which again is a word that means the people who of the Longhouse, and I'm very connected to all of the territories of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. I've had the pleasure and the honor of guest hosting for Tiogasin on First Voice of Indigenous Radio when Tiogasin travels or when he decides to go home, as he says, to go home and charge his batteries a little bit. I've had the privilege of guest hosting his show, and on one of those occasions, last summer, I was packing up from my hotel room, getting ready to leave, and I got a couple of emails that suggested that I go down to the UN because it was August 12th and it was World Indigenous Peoples Day. And I said, I'm not really a big fan. And I'll get into a little bit about my concerns about the UN and their best efforts in dealing with Native issues. But I was further encouraged because the program topic was Indigenous voices in the media. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I will go. Because the first thing that struck me is I was one of only 2 hosts in the entire state of New York that have a radio show. And I happened to be guest hosting the other one. And nobody thought well, maybe we should. We're in New York City, perhaps we should reach out to the Native person who's on the radio in New York City. And so that wasn't to be, so I went. And that's where I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Kalanui. She was on the panel, in fact, and did a wonderful job there, just as she did here. Eventually, they opened up the floor to the folks sitting in the assembly, basic General Assembly, and I was sitting right up front, and I was chosen first, and I probably talked much longer than the moderator wanted me to, as a matter of fact. They didn't bring out the hook, but I think they thought about it. And I raised those various issues. The first issue about, why you wouldn't reach out to somebody, a Native person on the radio to talk about Indigenous media. But I also raised the issue that if the UN really wanted to play a role in trying to encourage Native voices in the media, they should probably try to do some sort of endorsement, some solicitation, try to get public radio producers, public radio stations, underwriters to draw attention to it. Here the UN was taking a day out of its busy. Ban Ki-moon was there. The Undersecretary for Economic Development was there. And yet nobody addressed to me, which was the obvious. Perhaps it's time to put a little bit of pressure on the folks in public radio, because carving out an hour of public radio is the easiest way to afford a Native produced show to get on the air. Because buying a station is expensive. I am not afforded an hour. I buy my time. I'm on commercial radio. I'm on WWKB. It's one of those legendary rock and roll stations from the 50s, back when AM was king of music. And they are considered the left Entercom Communications, which owns the company, almost 5 stations, which is the way the radio business is done now. You have one company that owns 5, 6, 7, 8 stations in a given market, and so they have the flagship station, and then they have their redheaded stepchild. Well, WWKB is the redheaded stepchild, but the reason for me to be on that program is it happens to bang out with a 50,000 watt signal, a very powerful signal, especially in the evening, especially in the wintertime. My show can actually be picked up on AM radio as far as Hartford, Connecticut. I've had Jay Nightwolf, who does a show down in DC. Every once in a while, he'll run his car, sit in his car, turn on the AM radio, and see if he can pick me up on a Sunday night. I started off buying an hour, and frankly, I don't know how you guys do it. When Joseph does a show for an hour and when I guess those for him, I just feel like there's not enough time to really get a point across. And Tioga does an effective job, as Brother Kalanui, but it's tough. And especially if you want to really try to engage and get into a deeper conversation. It is really hard to do it in a 1 hour format. So when I garnered enough support to purchase another hour, I went to 2 hours. So I'm on from Sunday nights from 9-11. I have business cards I'll distribute to each one. Any of you can have one, so you don't need to write all this stuff down. I do write a blog, as Theoxen mentioned. I've been doing that for a long time. I've been doing that since 2007, 2008. I've been on radio doing my own show, Let's Talk Native with John Kane, I'm almost finished my 3rd year right now. And why do it? I mean, why do radio? And this is kind of the key to what Josep's panel was really here to discuss. The reason to do radio is because we have to get some of this information out there, and we've got to do it compellingly. We've got to do it in a way that we engage an audience. And It's not enough to do a blog. It's not enough to do internet radio. It's not enough to do a YouTube video every once in a while. If you don't have someplace on the dial, when somebody's in a car, and when somebody's, at home or whatever, you almost need a foundation. Radio is that perfect foundation. And whether it's commercial radio that paid programming like mine, or whether it's a university supported station, or a public radio, or semi/public radio, there's all kinds of animals out there. The reality is, to the extent that Tioga mentioned native-owned stations, many of the native-owned stations don't even have much native programming. Most of them, they get into this as a venture. They get into this as a commercial venture. So what happens is the native, and I can say this because the Seneca Nation owns a radio station in Western New York. I'm not on it. They're trying to make a commercial success of this thing, and it's pretty much failing miserably. So they don't treat it as a community service. They don't treat it as a means for them to control their own messages out there. They just play, good, easy listening rock and roll, kind of the milk toast stuff that you can find on a lot of these internet radio stations. So that's what they do there. I think that's going to change, because I think they're seeing the fall of their ways. But that goes to, you can go throughout Indian country. You can go out through all native territories, and you're going to find many native radio stations that maybe carve out a program here or there. But by and large, most of the programming on these stations are not really geared towards servicing their own community or doing an outreach to the non-native community. I'm in Buffalo. Again, in the territory of the Seneca Nation, Western New York. Powerful signal. I know that by and large, most of the people who are listening to my show are non-native. Most of my callers, it is a live show, it's a call-in show. Most of my callers are non-native. I do know that I have a strong native listenership. Again, hand out cards, you can go to my blog. I also have a page on KV's website. All of my shows are archived, you can listen to them. I will admit on the KV page, only for the last year have I written pretty much a description, so the dates are just dates. But on my blog, I pretty much have always had a description on the shows. And I've done shows that range from everything, from our conflicts with New York State, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we're here and the bastions of power of New York State are down in this neck of the woods, so I got to take my shots at Andrew Cuomo and others, so I'll do that while I'm here. And I do that. I take the opportunity to talk about the battles that we have with New York State. I also take the opportunity to talk about the battles we have with Washington. We are now living in a time where there's a Democrat in the White House and a Democrat in the governor's mansion. And we have some of the worst relationships with New York State and the federal government we've ever had. And I know the Crow gave Obama an Indian name. And there are people in the Indian country that would suggest that he's the greatest president that the native people have ever seen. Well, first off, I guess to clear a couple of things up. He's not my president. And Andrew Cuomo is not my governor. I'm Vinjagahaga. I'm not an American. I don't condemn those who are Americans. I don't condemn those who want to be Americans. I don't condemn Native people who want to be Americans. But the presumption that because I'm walking on the same streets that I'm American, and that I should somehow have some sort of patriotic duty. I'm one of those guys who don't understand why so many Native people enlist in the armed services. Frankly, other than it just being a continuation of a mentality that was born out of residential schools. But so I have some issues with that. On my show, I don't talk about what everybody else talks about. I really try to take the mystery out of what being a native is. I don't talk a whole lot about native spirituality. I don't try to interpret our creation story neither for the native people listening or for the non-native people. I have an opinion on that, and I have an opinion on a lot of things, and I'll share those. But that's not why I do radio. And in fact, if I do venture to talk about creation story, I'm going to talk about the pragmatic effect of it and why there's a moral to the story. I'm not going to preach about it as if it was Genesis from the Bible. I'm also not a fan of Indian treaties because they aren't. We didn't write them, we didn't ask for them, although we paid dearly for them. Those are a matter of U.S. law. Even though a good number of them were improperly ratified or not ratified at all on either side. Most of them are just a function of fraud and stealing land. Most of them have been broken in any number of ways. And I'll tell you, again, Haudenosaunee, one of the treaties that always gets brought up is the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua. Oh, how it's the seminal treaty of all treaties. Well, I'm sorry, that's bullshit. There are 7 articles in that treaty. 3 of them say the same thing, that the United States acknowledges that our land is ours and they will never claim the same. Never means never to me, but apparently it doesn't mean never to the United States. We're locked in the throes every single day, battling with New York State, trying to assert their jurisdiction, their sovereignty, their regulations, their laws on our people. So how the hell can New York State do that if the United States itself claims they will never claim our land? Well, we still maintain that our land is our land, in spite of what in spite of how they try to adjudicate it away, in spite of how they try to legislate it away, we're still there. These treaties, oftentimes people try to hang a singular thing on the thing to say, oh yeah, this is proof that this looks this. Every year there's a woman who sits down in Washington who's, among her many duties, is to requisition $4,500 worth of cloth. Because in the Canandaigua Treaty, there's a payment that was supposed to go on forever. And this payment was a payment in livestock, in farm equipment, in tools, and in cloth. In 1794, that was $4,500. Today, it's still $4,500. And for 100,000 Haudenosaunee, that breaks down to 4.5 cents worth of cloth each year. And yet, there are Native people who will treat that stuff like the shroud of Turin. I'm sorry, there's not enough cloth in 4.5 cents worth to do anything with, let alone wipe your ass. So, I'm not going to honor treaty cloth. I have some serious problems with anybody who would sit there and march up to a podium with a table there, lay out some cloth that they just got from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and say, look, there's the United States honoring its end of the deal. I'm sorry. And to me, it is as bold an insult as they could make. So unlike my friend here, I do talk a lot on my show, and I express opinion. My show is a news and views. Now, again, why do it? Because it matters. Because it makes a difference. And I'll tell you, I'll give you a few examples. Some of them may not be the most life-changing for all people, but we had an incident a couple of years ago where in New York, in Seneca Territory, they have a thing called a foundation called the Seneca Diabetes Foundation. And once a year, they do their gala event to raise money. And, you know, it's a black tie affair. I don't go too often. They hosted, on occasion, and on this occasion, they hosted the Seneca Niagara Casino, which is the casino in Niagara Falls that's owned by the Seneca Nation. So after all the doings, and there's a lot of non-native politicians and, civic leaders and that kind of stuff that go to these events. So, and it's in a casino. It is an alcoholic event. I mean, there's a bar and that kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, or after the event, down in the main lobby of the Seneca Niagara Casino, 2 Seneca gentlemen who were having a lively discussion. No, they were having an argument. They were calling each other down about and they're competing in the tobacco business with each other, which is another issue we're looking at. And they were having a dispute. And some little guy who happens to be a New York State Senator by the name of Mark Grisanti decided that he was going to insert himself into the discussion and say, oh, come on, you guys, why don't you just settle down? It's been a nice event. You don't need to be acting like that. Now, mind you, this is a Seneca event. These are Seneca gentlemen having this conversation. And it's in a Seneca venue. And as this guy approaches this event, this disturbance, it's already been broken up. But he decided that he wanted to insert himself into the whole thing. It didn't go well. To make a long story short, Mark Grisanti was rolling around on the casino floor. His wife came out, threw a drink in a Seneca woman's face, which I would never advise anybody to throw a drink into a Seneca woman's face, and actually raked her across the face with her fingernails. And so Mark Grisanti's wife got the crap pounded out of her as well. and of course it all got broken up. Immediate headlines, and I'm not talking about Western New York, New York Times, Washington Post, all over. In Europe, they were reporting how a New York State senator was savagely attacked by Indians at the casino. That was the headline. That was the immediate headline. I had folks that were there, come on my show, had somebody with cell phone video, keys to video. Within a day after my show, the headlines had turned around. So it was no longer New York State senator attacked by Indians. You know, and there was no more firewater comments. There were no more savage beatings. There was no more all the negative native epithets you could have put on there to describe what Mark Grisanti claimed happened to him. As a result of that, me telling the other story, the real story. Of course, the big question: well, when are we going to see the video? So casinos have surveillance cameras. You're never going to see the video. It's not my fault, but you're never going to see the video. That's not the nature of doing surveillance in a casino. It's not to drag somebody down. The police will look at it if there was a warrant and a charge, and somebody would be charged. And of course, everything that I said turned out to be true. Everything Mark Grisanti, the New York senator said, and his wife said, and they did press conference after press conference after press conference. Even his handlers were telling him, Mark, will you please shut the bleep up? You're not helping yourself any. My show, small show on AM radio in Western New York, changed that message. Now, as a result of doing that, it also thrust the idea of a native talk show host into other media sources. Channel 2, I've been on Channel 2 does a talk show on midday. That's the NBC affiliate in Buffalo. I've been on Two Sides for Christy Reserve a dozen times now. Susan Arbetter does a show called Capitol Press Room up in the Albany area, and it's on 20 other markets. Been on her show a dozen times. WBFO, which is the public radio station in Western New York, I've been on that program. Now all of a sudden, because I proved that I can be credible as a native radio talk show host, now they have somebody they can go to that's not going to give one-word answers. I don't mean to disparage native people when they get in front of the camera or get to a microphone, but too often our guys give one-word answers, and that does not make for good radio. That does not make for good television, and so that's oftentimes why you don't see it. And not to mention the fact that a lot of people will be gun shy. I'm not one of those people. I'm willing to talk about the issues and talk about the issues in a way that I think are engaging. I think it's important that people understand that the way the media portrays native issues or their failure to address native issues is something that's got to change. You know, it's one of the things that I brought up again at that UN conference or the UN event last summer. You know, the other thing I brought up at the UN was what I consider to be among the huge failings that the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People represents. One of the questions that I put to the panel, including my guests that are right here, was where's the rubber meet the road on this thing? Now, how do we end up, if not giving it force, but give it some meaning? Because frankly, the Declaration itself, as was indicated, falls pretty short on a lot of issues. It still really almost entrenches that relationship of the dominator versus the dominated. I mean, it is really, if you read it, it almost says it that way. I mean, it enforces the idea that you have an indigenous people who are entitled to some rights by their suppressors. I'm sorry, that's the way it reads. But it does do a couple of things. The third affirmation of the UN DRIP is as close to a UN attack on the doctrine of Christian discovery that exists anywhere. It really just calls it, without naming it, because they're not quite that bold yet. Although the World Indigenous Peoples Forum may finally get to that point next year, we'll see. The doctrine of Christian discovery is again, as Theophilus mentioned, it is born out of papal bulls from the 15th century. It is essentially not about converting native people into Christianity. It's not about saving souls. It was about expanding Christendom. It was about, and by Christendom it means creating a dominant society and dominating the land, the people, and the resources. Everything that we talk about here, I mean, this whole conference which, that is talking about the ecological issues, it's about, and again, as President Carney was discussing, it's all about exploiting the land and oftentimes either removing the native people that are there or, and it is an act of genocide, assimilation is an act of genocide, or converting them into something that they never were. Trying to turn them into American citizens, trying to turn them into New Yorkers or Canadians or Albertans or whatever. That's what, and that's born out of the doctrine of Christian discovery. I mean, and it is clear. It's clear. I've had Stephen Newcomb, who is really the foremost authority on the subject. He's been on my show twice. I got 4 hours of Stephen Newcomb. You can look it up. It's on my webpage. I actually brought Stephen Newcomb on when I guest hosted for Teokusin this last month, the month before. And his work, his book, which is Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, is the most important work on the subject done anywhere. He's brought that issue to the UN on several occasions, but if you ask Stephen Newcomb what his view about the UN doing anything with it, he's not optimistic. And nor am I. But I still will go down to the UN. If it's a forum to address issues, then I'm going to take that opportunity. And just like I'm paying every week to be on a commercial radio station, it's important. It's important work that we do. It's important work that we get it out there. It's important that we stand up and we fight for these issues. I'm rocking my I Don't Know More t-shirt. The problem I have with I Don't Know More is, frankly, it was a little too passive. And I know Deborah agrees with me on that because we've had some conversations on Facebook over it. They took a very strong position against nonviolent direct action. I'm Mohawk. It's in my genetic makeup to well, sometimes nonviolent direct action, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So the idea of just doing nice round dances to address subject, it's nice to draw attention to it. The last nice round dance I went to, I got into a scuffle with a Cheektowaga police officer because he was trying to shut it down. To me, that's my kind of demonstration. So it's on YouTube, by the way. You can look up Cheektowaga police. Anyway, I have that. I also have a video from going to the UN, and that's on my my blog. My videos on my blog as well. But you have to resist, and there are ways to resist. The one thing about standing up and really actually getting physical without getting myself arrested with a policeman. And I became the center of the attention, and I didn't go there for that. I was going to round dance like everybody else. But I saw a mall cop like losing his mind, and I asked him, "We got a problem?" He goes, "You're fucking right, we have a problem." He says, "I got the Cheektowaga police, the Williamsville police, and the Clarence police coming here right now, and you're going to arrest all your asses." Really? I couldn't even like smile at this guy. I did lots of smiling with the Cheektowaga police officer. As he grabbed me and I walked him back 3 or 4 steps, and I said, and I again smiled broadly, and I said, "You really want to do this? Just look at this. There's like hundreds of people here. There's maybe 500 or 600 people. Not the 5,000 you would see at the Edmonton Mall or even the Mall of America, but I disarmed him. I did. I changed his mind, and that's my point. My point is, you can't just write letters to congressmen, and you can't just Facebook each other. Sometimes you got to do stuff. Sometimes you got to stand up. And the idea of doing radio is not to be, for me, is never to be the last word on any of these subjects. It's to continue the conversation, encourage the conversation, feed the conversation, so the conversation continues. And so that conversation goes beyond the conversation and then turns into action. We do need to stand in the way of the XL pipeline. And it's not just about pipelines that leak. It's about the idea of wiping out an area the size of Florida and Alberta, wiping out a boreal forest, and creating, right now, their inability to get those tar sands oils to market is the bottleneck that is everything slowing it down right now. I don't think just stopping the Keystone XL pipeline is enough. There's going to have to be more direct action than that. And it's not just on us, it's on all of you. At some point, we all need to stand up. It's nice to have an opinion about something. But if people don't stand up and do things about it, then that opinion is meaningless. And we can't all do everything all of the time. Part of the reason I got into radio is, frankly, I'm not getting any younger. I've had my knockdown dragouts. And it's like I tell people, I only got about half a can of whoop-ass left in me. and I'm saving it. So in the meantime, I'll dance with the Cheektowaga police officer, but I hope I don't have to wrestle. But somebody may have to. When I really got involved in Native issues, I was in my 20s, you know, and I really got active. And when you're 20, you're bulletproof and invisible. You can do all kinds of things. I'm a grandfather now. I've raised 3 children. And I raised 3 children on Native territory. And I'm going to digress a little bit. I raised 3 kids. I didn't put one of them through rehab, and I haven't had to bail one of them out of jail. I've had to be bailed out of jail a few times along those ways. But I trust me. When I had to get bailed out of jail, it was because I was fighting for something I believed in. It wasn't because I was, you know, got caught doing something. I have 6 grandchildren now. When you're young and you're an activist, and even when you're a father, you don't anticipate, at least I did, maybe other people, you don't anticipate being a grandparent. And you don't know what that does to you. I've also had the misfortune to see my middle daughter lose her husband, fine son of a Seneca young man, to bone cancer a year ago last December. There's reasons people get bone cancer. And oftentimes those reasons have to do with what's happened to our territories, to that pollution that's in the ground. Onondaga Lake is the most polluted lake in the country, in the United States. 13 feet of mercury in the bottom of Onondaga Lake. Upstream of the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation is West Valley Nuclear Storage Facility. And it's funny, they talk about, they don't call it, there's another word for it, they don't call it breach, but they talk about when they have a leak, essentially, when that radioactivity makes it into the Cattaraugus Creek, they got a word for it. But, so that's what we have to address. Of course, I know Theokosen has addressed it on his show, the open uranium mines in the Lakota territory. The coal top, the mountaintop removal for coal, hydrofracking, not just the pipelines issues, but all of them. In Akwesasne, which is the Mohawk territory at the top of the state, Akwesasne is a unique place in that somebody decided they were going to put a line, pretend there's a line that goes through the river there, and they call one side of it Canada and the other side the United States. And then on the side that's on the Canadian side, they call one part of it Ontario and the other part of it Quebec. So in Akwesasne, Mohawk territory, you've got a native territory, a Gunagahaga territory that is divided by 2 provinces, a state, and 2 countries. So you have Alcoa and GM that have basically polluted the area so bad, and there's several Superfund sites up there on the St. River, on the Grass River, and a couple of the other rivers up there. Leukemia is a bomb. Even doing basic farming, they had a problem where their cattle were dying, their teeth were falling out. And nobody talks about this stuff. That's why we have to do radio. That's why what Theokosen does is important. That's why what Professor Carvanui does is important. But the thing is, there needs to be more voices. And for those of us, what we do is we take these shows and we put them on the internet. And sometimes we make a YouTube video, or we talk about it on Facebook. This information has to get out, and it's relevant and it's important. Because things have to be done. And it matters because it does affect change. Now, I'm not saying we're winning the battle, but I will say this. This generation, and I'm not going to say this with a whole lot of caution, this generation has done to advance sovereignty than the 7 before us. Yeah, I said it. I just called down my ancestors. I'm sorry, because when we talk 7 generations, we've got to go farther back than that before we have people who really have their minds right. Corn Planter, Handsome Lake, These guys signed away more land. When I hear people condemn our young people, the alcoholism that existed in Seneca territory, for instance, and not just Seneca territory, but in the territory of the Haudenosaunee from 1790s, that Canandaigua Treaty, I told you the good parts. The bad parts is all the land got ceded, except for a couple of tiny little spots, they got screwed out of subsequently from that. So from 1784 to 1848, we still had our language. We still had traditional chiefs. What we didn't have is we didn't have a clan system anymore. What we had was arrogant men in our territory who bought into the male-dominant society bullshit that Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and others were pushing on. Women didn't get taken out of our fields because the plow was too heavy for them. Trust me. Our women could handle the plow. Women got taken out of our fields because those men were convinced that you needed to put women in the home. You needed to take them out of the fields. You couldn't let the women dominate or control the food supply. You couldn't let women be the title holders of that land, not the owners, because we don't own the land. We vested the title of our lands on our women because they were holding it for the faces unborn. I'll tell you a story. There was a gentleman, and I heard the story once. A gentleman shows up to a old native guy. Of course, first thing he calls him is Chief. Hey, Chief! Do you know who owns this land? And he said, yeah, because I'd like to buy it. I've got lots of money to spend. He says, yeah, I know who owns this land. And he says, well, where can I find them? They're not here. Oh, when are they going to be here? He turns and he looks and he sees, he looks back and he sees a couple of young women over there. One of them's got a bit of a belly. About 3 months. I'll tell you what, Chief, I'll be back in 3 months. 3 months later, he comes there. And he says, did those people who own that land show up yet? He says, no. The folks who own this land are not here yet. Not here yet. Really? He says, what do you think they're going to be here? He gets back and he sees a woman there taking care of a little baby. Sees another little girl, only just a little tiny bump. 6 months. The guy comes back 6 months. And this repeated. What he didn't understand was that land is for the unborn faces. Once you're born, your job becomes to maintain that land stays for the unborn faces. We've had some bad history. And although I don't think we're winning the war yet, this generation has done a lot. Folks like some of the ones that are here. And folks that you'll never know their names. Some that are no longer with us. There's been plenty that have stood up and have changed the conversation. People didn't, sovereignty isn't our word. We took one from you, from French anyway. The closest word we have in Mohawk means to carry yourself. So when we talk about sovereignty, we look at it different than the way Europeans did. And in fact, in 1776, when the colonists decided that they needed to somehow break the chains that bound them to England, they needed to, this wasn't just about an impending war. They had to build a rationale. They had to explain how it is that the rest of the world could accept that they were going to break their ties to their motherland. So where did they come up with such a rationale? Well, they came up with it from us. The idea that sovereignty was bestowed upon a royal family by God, that was the European model. And there was some buzz in Europe at the time, with Locke, Voltaire, there were people that talked about these kinds of things, and that geez, maybe we don't have it quite right. Poor people were starting to say, you know, I don't know that I like this system. So where in the world did the system exist where sovereignty was a birthright? Here. And I'm not just talking, I'm speaking of Haudenosaunee, but I know that it wasn't just Haudenosaunee lands. It was here that the concept that you were born, and not just we as people, but all of creation. The creation, and I'm not going to say the creator, I'm not going to say great spirit, creation provided a path for everything that we see, whether it's the moon across the sky, whether it's the stars across the sky, whether it's the thunders that come through, whether it's the strawberries that grow, whether it's our children, whether it's a rabbit, whatever it is. We all, in fact, we sometimes refer to it as our original message, our original instructions. You'll hear that sometimes if you're around Indian country long enough. Again, I try to put it in a way that people understand it. We've all been provided with a path. That path is natural. And so that path is a part of being born, it's a part of being created. It is not something that, and it's individual. We all have the right and the responsibility, what's the word? We have that responsibility to carry ourselves. We also have a responsibility to carry others and to help others and to make sure that we give back to the occasion and that kind of thing. But sovereignty is an individual birthright, in my way. It is not a collective right. It is a right we defend collectively, but it's not the tribe's power. It's not the BIA's recognized leadership that has that power. It is not the chief, it's not the clan mother, it's not the president, it's not the trustee, it's not whatever, band council chief. They are not the ones who have been invested or vested with that authority. Every one of the children, all of us are. And we've never divested ourselves of that to them, nor have we divested any of that to the state, the federal government, the province. The question about treaties isn't where in the treaty does it say you can sell cigarettes. The question is, where did we give you the right to tell us what we do on our territories? The whole conversation has to be turned around. We don't need to defend our sovereignty in their courts of law. And if we get dragged to their courts of law, let them produce the foundation for their imposition, for their subjugation. Because I guarantee the only place they can never take it back to, it's going to be the papal bulls from 1493. Because there is no foundation of law. Because you can't adjudicate our sovereignty away, and you can't legislate it. The international community, they would never say, well, if you pass a law in this country that says this person, in 1924, the U.S. Senate declared all Native people born in the United States, or in the boundary of the United States, were U.S. citizens. I didn't ask to be a U.S. citizen. And they did, and the fact of the matter is, perhaps some did. And there were a few little ways that people could do that. Part had to do with military service before that. But when they passed the law, the Haudenosaunee rejected it, as did others. You can't just pass a law and say that somebody has ceased to exist. I mean, I'll say, I take it back. Yes, you can. You can pass a law and say somebody ceased to exist. It doesn't mean it ceased to exist. We're still here. I'm still Ganyagahaga. And they can't. A judge can't say that we don't exist. We're in the throes of battles with New York State every single day. Andrew Cuomo, we're battling New York State over gaming revenue, we're battling them over them trying to interfere. And I'm not going to talk about the gaming stuff as much. And to the extent that I want to talk about, mention the tobacco issue, and because I think it's important people know this. We carved out a private sector business that is also part of, oftentimes their native tribes that are engaged in this business. And we utilize the fact that New York State cannot impose its taxation on us. We've been doing it for over 30 years. We've been in the tobacco business for about 10,000 years. In fact, you can go out to Lakota territory, and there are specific strains of tobacco that are in Lakota territory that specifically came from the Haudenosaunee, from the Lenape, from the Algonquins, and different people. So that's the trade that's gone on for thousands and thousands of years. So when John Rolfe, who kidnapped and brainwashed Pocahontas, co-opted the tobacco business into something that we never intended to be, they built something else. And when we re-entered that trade back 30, 40 years ago, New York State didn't know what to do about it. because they knew they didn't really have any legal foundation to stop them. But we weren't making cigarettes. We were just buying Philip Morris products, without the tax on it and selling it, non-native people coming onto our territory. But that's not the business as it exists today. Now we have major manufacturers on both the north side of the Magnolia line, Oswego, Grand River in Ontario, Grand River Enterprises, manufacturers of Seneca brand cigarettes, and we have manufacturers in Washington, Yakima, and there's territories all around that are manufactured. New York State is suing any of the manufacturers, native manufacturers of native products from outside the state, suing them, trying to bar them from being able to bring from their product coming to our territory. Now this is native-to-native trade that Andrew Cuomo, Eric Schneiderman, and then the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance Commissioner Thomas Maddox, that they are fully engaged right now. And native-to-native trade, even if it's not a very politically correct product like cigarettes, is still something that we need to fight for. I don't fight for casinos, I don't fight for tobacco, but I do fight for sovereignty. And so we have to defend we have to stand up. And it's important that people know in New York State, in New York City, and across the country, that the things that we're engaged in with Andrew Cuomo is really an affront to all native territories. And again, he's suing a manufacturer in Yakima territory. So this is the battle we're still in every day. And I talk about these things, again, that's the value, and that's why I'm glad Tiokasin brought this subject to this forum. Because I don't know that I'm left. I don't know that I'm liberal. I know that I'm native. I know that I'm Gunjagahaga. And I'll come back to this forum as long as they'll keep having this. And we'll make as much noise in every forum that they provide for us, including on the radio. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left, but I just wanted to say a few words about First Voices Indigenous Radio and these two people here, good friends. Very honored to have them and you here. And my sisters from out in Arizona and South Dakota are here, and they feel like home. And it's hard to do that in New York City. And the radio I did, I started out, I'll tell you how First Voices Indigenous Radio started out. The original name of the program I did was Exposing the Apologetic Predator. And it speaks for itself, right? That was in Olympia, Washington. And I did it because I was walking by a radio station and it happened to be the October 10th and it was a day before Columbus. And the guy asked me, he said, there's an Indian out there, let's ask him to come in and say this poem. So I went in and read it, and the board lit up because I added a few words to it, and apparently they didn't agree with it. So I came back, and the next day I left for San Francisco, where about 200,000 indigenous people gathered to celebrate the 500-year celebration, survival of Prince Centennial celebration in San Francisco. And out of that, people were needing an indigenous radio program. And I knew at that time there were other Native American programs, but not an indigenous radio program, meaning indigenous peoples all over the world. Because this is the reason why I do this, is because there's 7,000 languages spoken totally in the world. 5,600 of those languages are indigenous. And in 80 years, at the rate it's going, 64 a year are going extinct. By the end of this century, there will be no more indigenous languages spoken. That means no more indigenous peoples. And that's the one reason why I do that, and I focus in on the world. And of that, there you have to know that the reason why is because here's what I think, just to be short, because I know we're running out of time, that we suffer from PTSD. Now, I'm not going to say it's the common PTSD that you know. I call it patriarchal traumatic stress disorder.
And on.
That's what we are going through. This is the reason why, is because today in the world, the English language in America and other Romance languages, but mainly in the United States, is that 60% of the English language is based in Latin. And their meanings are used to dominate and control and commit war, possess, rationalize occupancy of the lands of the Western Hemisphere. And this is what we operate under, even the left or the right, and that's why I don't like what John said, because the left to me is just the left arm of the right. There's no difference to Native people, but they think it is because it's being altered native. So it doesn't make a difference to Native people, and I agree with that. And I think that because of I think it was 597 treaties that were signed or actually negotiated with the United States, is that they cannot be rescinded or how do you say it, reactivated, is because they have this Latin in place. And I had a friend, Jose Cruz, I think was with the National Indian Treaty Council in 1992. I met him in Hawaii, and he said that he went down into the lower levels of the Smithsonian, and there he saw most of the treaties. They were in little files and drawers, and he noticed that some of these treaties, the Native people, of course, inked it, and the name was signed in ink. But the officials of the U.S. government signed theirs in pencil. So this was another manipulation besides everything else he saw in that. So this is why I think the treaties will never be brought back, is because it's based in Latin. And they can't comprehend indigenous languages. This is why they have to get rid of indigenous languages. And I know from elders, like 20% of our language cannot be translated into English because the concepts are too abstract. They're too inclusive. And one word that has gotten to everybody because of the patriarchy and the patriarchal language, hierarchical language, one word is what we don't have, and I got this from Virgil Kilstraight about 2 years ago, and it was in research with Steve Newcomb, who did Pagans in the Promised Land. And we were in Auschwitz, Birkenau, of all places. And we were sitting there, and we were discussing things with a priest of all, a Catholic priest. And he was using the word domination quite a bit. And I asked Virgil, and he knew something. I said, Virgil, is there a word for domination, or a concept of domination in that book? He said, no. So this is why the 1,400 that are marketable languages, the rational, hierarchical, patriarchal languages, they can sell and buy you, and make you slaves. And this is why radio has to be done this way. And I think it's the most dangerous thought process, because that 1% they occupy is always talking about. Well, we see the 99%, because the 1% of its native people, which the population is in the United States, are the 1% that are balancing out that 1% at the other side. Because of the way we think. And native radio is what it's an oral tradition. I think it needs, and it's needed here, and any of you who have the gumption and want to get into radio and to prove yourself wrong before you say something on the radio, not other people. Prove yourself wrong. Because you have an experience as an indigenous person to bring to the air. You don't have a right. I don't deal with this right. That's their word for us. We have a responsibility. It's more at home when we have a responsibility. And I've interviewed everybody from Robert Kennedy to Mikhail Gorbachev, of all people. And these people I've interviewed. And they're looking towards indigenous peoples. There's not enough to take reference from, because they don't know who to go to. They'll go to the one who's playing the drums and the flutes and wearing the feathers and talking noble instead of the ones on the ground. So this is what I'd like to say, and I'd like there's a couple more questions here, and if you have one for a panelist here for each of them, and then we have to move out of here and continue. So But that's our presentation for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering about like broadcast radio. Is there like a digital divide in upstate New York or with indigenous people? Because increasingly, like having to be like on like a radio station is becoming, almost like if you say like you put it up on the web, why not just make it downloaded then? You know what I'm saying? Like you're saying it's important to have that central hub. And I'm just wondering, in a digital age, is it so important to have that central hub?
There really is a strong need to get it out over the airwaves first. And the reason is you get more interactive. I know you can do the same thing with live internet radio. And I do stream live, and the guard will give you a little bit of information on how to do that. But going over the air, it allows you to catch some people even by accident. You don't listen to people on the internet by accident. You have to look for them. Oftentimes, what I find is that you'll stumble across people, or I should say, people will stumble across you. And frankly, we've got to find people whichever way we can. And we don't have agents, and we don't exactly have PR firms that are promoting it. So we've got to be, and by being on a commercial radio station that's already advertising themselves, even if not our shows, in some means, whether it's even through WBAI, for instance, helping with some of the events here. The stations get out there. And so at this point, perhaps that's not going to be the paradigm always, but it is now. I still think it is now.
Hi, I'm John Nelson. We came down from Woodstock with the Elks Eagles and Stephanie Wells. And we're doing a community radio project from the Dakotas, coming from Manitoba. And how can they interface with you guys?
Well, you got my card. If you want to, and it's a call-in show, so anybody can participate in my show anytime they want to. They don't even need to get free prior and informed consent. They can just do it anytime they want. But certainly, if somebody wants to, whether they physically come into the studio, which is always best, if they want to physically come in the studio, by all means, reach out to me, and we'll arrange it. And then I can promote it a little bit as well. But if not, then just get all people to do a phone-in.
I know, if you look up First Voices Indigenous Radio, I'll put panels that were happening at 5:30 and now, and the information on it, firstvoicesindigenousradio.org. I'll put where you can find websites and everything like that. Oh, by the way, First Voices Indigenous Radio is now heard on 45 radio stations in North America. Only 3 of those are native, the rest of the country, they're playing at prime time. So it's an addition to what they do, so it's complementary.
And also, too, if I can just reiterate the URL for my show, it's www.indigenouspolitics.com. I have an indigenouspolitics.org site, but it's not up and running yet. And I have a welcome message that has my email there. And the show is broadcast on 11 stations through the Pacifica network through 10 states. And I'm happy to take it to any station that welcomes it. So if you're coming from around the country and know of a local station, one of the things that I do is I do it every other week. And my own home station alternates my show with Joseph show. So there's many ways to do that where we're working together to try and make it so that hour is on there every week at least.
But I like to now cut us off. I'm sorry, but the next panel's coming in. Some of us are here already, so stay around for that. And that's it. Thank you to Kaylani and Jonathan.